What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing the Demon of Brownsville Road. So recently, while I was watching one of the YouTube channels that kind of just randomly pop up from time to time, I came across a man in an interview who was talking about his experiences in a haunted house in Pennsylvania. It was incredibly interesting because this wasn't a typical haunting story, as I see so much of in my line of work. This man was convinced, and he felt he knew for certain, based on the history of the home and his experiences in it, that he and his family were dealing with something evil, something not of this earth, and that never was a part of humanity. A demon, a demonic presence. The video was really short, and when I saw that this guy had written a book about all of it, I immediately went to Audible and purchased it. But I don't know who made the decision for the voice, like the person who narrated the book, but the AI I used to read my books on that app was way more interesting. What I mean is, the voice was so incredibly dull and boring, I couldn't listen to it beyond the second chapter. So I did what I always do and just started with my normal research into the so-called Demon of Brownsville Road. And of course, in doing so, I knew I had to bring you all into this with me as well. So here we are. For those of us in this community and outside of it too, I guess, there's honestly nothing more terrifying than experiencing a haunting. To be at the mercy of supernatural forces you can't even see has to be an absolutely helpless and hopeless feeling. I'm sure as well that most people who deal with hauntings don't really understand it and could end up traumatized and with the lives of everyone involved changed forever. This is why this case was so interesting to me, because imagine all of those feelings and how your life would change if it were something demonic and completely malevolent that was haunting you and your family. How would you feel then? The latter is exactly what happened to a well-respected family in a tiny town in Pennsylvania, and this is the story according to the witnesses as they remember it. Let's jump right in. In December of 1988, Bob Cranmer bought the house of his dreams for him and his family to live in. Bob had grown up in the small community located right near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, of Brownsville. And when he was growing up, he would always stare at the house and imagine himself owning it. That house had been calling to Bob Cranmer for as long as he could remember, but he didn't realize at the time that he may have been being lured into a trap. Bob and his wife had decided the best thing for him to do for their family was to leave the military and go and buy the house he had dreamed about on Brownsville Road. He and his wife did kind of wonder why the sellers had taken the very first offer they'd received from the Cranmers, as admittedly it was terribly lowballed, but take it they did, and the Cranmers couldn't believe their good luck. This was no ordinary suburban home. This was a giant old Victorian mansion, and Bob said that there hadn't even been any bidding involved with this purchase. He also mentioned in the book and the interview I watched that the owners who sold the home to him were a bit strange when they were all doing the walkthrough together. The old woman seemed surly and unfriendly, and both she and her husband seemed very nervous about something, and Bob and his wife couldn't tell what it was they were keeping from them, but they could tell something was being kept. The Cranmers just thought that perhaps there were some repairs that would end up popping up randomly without any warning on them. No one at this time was thinking that they were hiding what could be a demonic presence, and that it was the real reason the house was so quickly and for so cheap put up for sale in the first place. Bob thought it was fate that had made it possible for him to buy his literal dream home, and you'll see more and more as we go through this story, it more than likely was, but not in the way he was thinking. Bob's youngest son, who I think was around 3 years old at the time, got lost while walking through the old house. Bob's wife noticed that he wasn't there, and she and everyone else who were walking through the basement of the home at the time started to look for him. They finally found him, but the elderly woman snapped at the mother, that she needed to learn to keep a better eye on her children, which it's kind of rude. The wife, Bob said, is pretty good at like keeping her calm and like not saying anything back, but he's not, so he kind of snapped back at her. It became this thing. Bob and his wife were shocked at the comment, but because she seemed so nasty to begin with, They very quickly let it go and just figured that maybe she was being uptight about having to sell this beautiful home. You see, the reason the old couple gave for needing to get rid of the house so quickly and for such little money was because they said that the elderly woman had gotten a new job and was required to live in a certain place because of it. So the elderly woman said that she had to live in a specific city, not in Brownsville, and she didn't want to do the commute, and that was why, which kind of doesn't make sense. I don't know. Does that make sense to you guys? It was all very strange though, and the little boy wouldn't leave his mother's side for the whole rest of the walk, and he kept talking about how terrified he was. Bob and his wife chalked it up to nerves about being in this gigantic old house. They had been living in a tiny apartment before purchasing the house, and they had 3 children at the time. The boy, or so they thought, was just maybe nervous about how creepy the old mansion was, and they figured he'd get used to it once they moved in and it actually became his home. Once the move was completed, though, things got steadily more bizarre for this family. The house looked, by all accounts, very normal in every possible way, but the family immediately felt like not only they were being constantly watched in the home, no matter what they were doing or where they were doing it, but Bob just had a strange feeling he couldn't quite put his finger on, that something just wasn't right somehow, despite him now being the new owner of his literal dream home. In fact, everyone felt like the normalcy and beauty of the home was somehow a facade, hiding what was truly just underneath the surface. Of course, they all felt weird about feeling the weirdness, and mostly they didn't talk about it. Bob said about it, quote, "From first, Lisa and I always had the feeling we were not alone in that house, that we were being watched by someone or something. We felt surrounded by the past, as if we were almost living in it, that we were only quote-unquote temporary visitors tolerated for the time being, but who would eventually be expelled," end quote. The good news for them was this feeling alone did not last very long. The bad news is that it didn't last long because it graduated into actual paranormal activity that no one could deny, even though they still tried to deny it. It started off innocently, as it usually does, and the lights would flicker on and off on their own, random objects would be strangely misplaced, and many other small oddities that could be explained away as things that just happen in homes that are almost 100-year-old mansions started to happen. There was an incident with the light that I think kind of brought Bob around to understanding that he and his family were dealing with something more than the strange ticks of an old home, though. Each morning when Bob woke up to go to work, he would go through his routine, and then on his way out the door, he would grab his work coat from a closet in the hallway downstairs by the front door. The closet had one of those lights where it's a bulb, but there's a chain that hangs down from it that you pull in order to turn the light on and off. Every single morning, the chain would be neatly wrapped around the light itself or the little screw that held it into the ceiling instead of dangling down so someone could just reach in and grab it, which is how it's supposed to be. It was frustrating for Bob because it was dark sometimes and he couldn't see enough in the already somewhat dim old parlor or hallway, and he would have to struggle to find the string. Eventually, he knew where it would be, and he knew his kids weren't doing it as they were very young at the time, and he said the light was about 6 feet off the floor. He asked his wife if maybe she had been doing it in order to play some kind of weird prank on him or for some other reason, but she insisted she had no idea what in the world he was talking about. So he and his wife Lisa came up with a plan that he would go to work and she wouldn't go into the closet all day, and just to be sure to keep the kids away from it as well. So he would leave the string dangling. Sure enough, when he got home from work that day, the string for the light, which he had kept in its dangling position when he left that morning, was neatly wrapped around the light again. He and his wife then thought that perhaps they had some sort of friendly, funny ghost in the house, like Casper, and they made light of the situation, asking whatever presence was there not to do that again. It kept happening though, so he and Lisa just moved on from it. A lot of what was happening in the home were things that they all could just write off as their imaginations playing tricks on them, and Bob said the idea of a ghost came and went, but they never really took it too seriously, at least not at first. It then progressed though, again as these things inevitably do, and the usual slamming and opening back up of random doors and loud stomping footsteps trotting and running all through the house at all hours of the day and night started soon after they had started coming to terms with the fact that their old house was, quote, just weird sometimes, end quote. The children were getting older, and there is so much that happened throughout the years to this family that I would never be able to tell it all in the overviews that I do. By the time the kids were teenagers, everyone in the family knew their house was possessed by something evil, and it made sense to Bob and Lisa Finally, why the elderly couple had wanted so badly to get rid of it, and also why the woman had seemed so mean and surly, particularly about when their small son had gotten momentarily lost. It scared the family even more when they would find things smashed and broken, and once they even found a crucifix that had been strangely and purposefully misshapen and tossed haphazardly onto the floor, nowhere near where it had been hung by the family. In addition to everything else that was already going on, there was a room in the house that seemed to be the center of everything happening as far as the haunting, and this room scared the whole family more than any other. They called it the blue room, and that was because it had blue wallpaper and blue rugs. One of the kids started off as sleeping in that room and insisted that there was some sort of evil supernatural force or presence inside of it. None of the children wanted to sleep in that room, and eventually they refused to even go near it, and they would complain that there was something not right with it, that quote-unquote something bad lived in there. The presence eventually began to make itself visible to the whole family, and it projected itself as a very dark shadow entity that was wrapped in black smoke and mist, and was followed around by a disgusting and very foul stench. This figure would only appear in the blue room, at least for a little while, but eventually it would be seen in other areas of the home as well. I guess when everyone started staying away from it and out of that room, it needed to get its energy somehow, and so it branched out into other areas of the home to terrorize and terrify this family. Bob reported that one of the most terrifying encounters ever had with this particular entity happened to his son-in-law when he saw a gigantic and hulking shadow figure looming over one of his children's beds. Once the son-in-law laid eyes on it, it slithered away into a darkened crawl space where it vanished. One of Bob's grandsons saw it too at some point, and when he did, he was immediately frantic. He panicked, screaming and crying inconsolably, quote, "Monster, the monster will get me," end quote. Bob's grandchildren stayed just as far away from the blue room in particular as his own children, and he and his wife had stayed all those years before. I would like to stop here for a moment and talk about something I haven't mentioned yet. Bob spent time trying to be a preacher, and he was a devoutly religious man. When he left the army and was trying to find his calling, he ended up feeling as though he were being led to be a preacher, more of a man of God. He said he wasn't very good at it though, and so he moved on to do politics on a smaller scale in Pittsburgh, and I think even in Brownsville. He liked being known when he walked down the street, and he wanted to be where he could provide the most help. One of the kids, Bob's youngest son, refused to let a priest into his room to bless it. The little boy was adamant that the man of cloth could not enter his room, and especially couldn't bless it. This was all those years before when they had first moved in. It was the same little boy who had gotten lost during the walkthrough. Bob and his wife were somewhat mortified that their son had been behaving that way to the priest, but the priest just laughed it off. No one saw this as a sign of something dangerous, maybe telling the kid, you know, you better keep that priest out of here, kid. And I guess nobody made any sense of it because it was the early 1980s when they moved into the house on Brownsville Road, the late 80s, I think, 88. And the paranormal wasn't nearly as trendy as it is today, right? The reason I brought all that up is because I wonder if his trying to become a pastor would have interfered with how the house would have been able to treat him. Meaning, he had been drawn to that house ever since he was a little boy, and he always knew in his heart that it would be his, that he would own it. It had almost been like a compulsion. If he had been a pastor, a man of the cloth, so to speak, then would he maybe have noticed what was happening right away, and would he have been better equipped to put a stop to it? I don't know, but I figure this is as good a thing as any to speculate about. Okay, so back to this shadowy figure. Its torment on everyone in the family went on for years, and as time progressed, it seemingly became more and more emboldened to terrorize everyone in the family as well. It also became more violent as time went on. It would not only appear in other areas of the house and not just the blue room anymore, but the family could actually hear it, usually in the middle of the night, crawling and creeping all around and throughout and within the walls of the home. It was around that time when everyone in the family started to be attacked by unseen hands. The attacks were described as ferocious, and they usually happened in the areas that were near to the blue room. The family all would end up with strange scratches and bruises all over their bodies, and once, one of Bob's older sons ended up with deep and angry claw marks going right down his chest from top to bottom. That event was what caused Bob and Lisa to finally start facing the fact that they weren't dealing with a friendly ghost, and it certainly wasn't an ordinary haunting, if such a thing even exists, right? Bob knew then that they were most likely dealing with a demon. Bob names the demon, and so did my source material, but that's foolish, as if I say this creature's name, I could invoke it and bring it onto any one of you who maybe aren't in the best state spiritually or vibrationally. Being a medium, it's just not a good idea. The name begins with an M, and how Bob knew this was the demon he and his family were dealing with is anyone's guess. He probably goes into it at length in his book, but I haven't gotten that far yet, and I always tell you guys I do overviews to keep it shorter and more simple for your listening pleasure. Bob started putting up a ton of religious imagery and reading the Bible voraciously to try and ward this thing off, but all he ended up doing was infuriating it even more. Demons never like it when you're onto them. Bob said that the entity would rip the Bible right out of his hands, destroy all of his rosaries, scratch his neck up, and twist and warp every single one of the crucifixes in the home. It also seemingly hated the film The Passion of the Christ, which Bob would play in the home often, and whenever he did so, the TV would constantly turn off, and the demonic entity would kick up a ruckus each and every time. Now, The Passion of the Christ was released on DVD in the United States, for the most part, on August 31st, 2004. And so now, the Cranmers had been dealing with this entity and probably a few others since they moved into the place back in 1988. That's 26 years. And with each year that passed, they were terrorized even more. I don't understand why they never left. It's more than likely that, without them even knowing or realizing it, they were kept there by the entity, and I would be surprised if the thought of moving out ever seriously crossed their minds because of that fact. I see it all the time in instances where someone has a real demonic presence in their home. It doesn't occur to them. I could be wrong. Like I said, this is just overview information, but it is something to think about. Some of the family members and those who would visit from time to time would wear crucifixes to try and keep the demon at bay or to ward it off from them. It never failed, though, that they would find that the necklaces would be removed from their bodies, often with them having been bent in half, quote, as if they had been placed in a vise and bent with pliers, end quote. To make matters even more creepy, a hidden room was found behind a wall, which had been very obviously sealed up at some point before the Cranmers moved in, and for reasons they could only guess at. When they opened up the partition that had been hiding this little room in the walls, they found toys from when their kids were little, their son's Legos and other things. How in the world would toys get inside of a wall that's already completely sealed up, and why were they taken and put there in the first place? It's inexplicable. But then again, so much is that way when dealing with the demonic and sometimes even regular supernatural forces. Finally, after all those years of suffering and with everyone in the family who had been subjected to it, dealing with various degrees of mental stress and strain, Bob reached out to the local Catholic Church with their problem. Over the course of 2 years, a procession of bishops and priests would go and visit with them in the home, and they would carry out masses and exorcisms. This took Bob back to the original walkthrough of the home he and Lisa had done with the previous owners, when the old man had mentioned that they had had plenty of masses in the living room and that communion had been taken in that room by the family many, many times. Bob thought it was odd, as he had been raised a Catholic and knew that Mass, and especially communion, could only be given in the sanctity of the church, and there was no reason he could think of as to why a priest would have allowed them to have those specific ceremonies inside of a house. But when Bob had asked the man about it, the man looked frightened and refused to talk about it any further. Now, to most of us, this would be a huge red flag, but we have to remember that the original walkthrough happened in the late 1980s, and so paranormal activity wouldn't have been anything that came to Bob's mind at all for any reason. So the priests and the bishops observed a lot of the paranormal activity for themselves during the masses and communions they performed and held over the course of those 2 years. And along with other holy men, Bob and his wife allowed a paranormal investigative team to come in and check things out as well. This was after the paranormal craze had gone mainstream, and it seemed like the next logical step in trying to uncover and get rid of whatever was in their home so they could finally live in peace there. After 26 years. It was the early 2000s though, and the only show out at the time was Paranormal State. In fact, if you guys are familiar with that show, then you will know that Ryan Boole, who is the head of the team of investigators for that show, always said that he had messed up and then had a demon following him because of a home he had visited once to try and help in an investigation, and he had messed that investigation up, and this demon had attached to him. According to Bob Cranmer, the demon following and tormenting Ryan Boole is the demon from his house on Brownsville Road, and it latched onto Ryan when he and his team came to investigate what was happening there. Ryan never named the demon either. Ryan also claimed that during the investigation, he had witnessed a crucifix being bent in half with his own 2 eyes. He also witnessed blood appearing on the walls, which Bob said at around this time, it was happening all of the time. One of the priests who visited the home also reported what he had seen, and that was blood flowing down the stairs as he was attempting to douse them with holy water. Somehow, and the information is sketchy online as to how this came to be, the house was deemed demon-free in 2006. I think all the help from the priests and bishops and all the masses and communions done and held there probably is what took care of this demonic presence once and for all. Bob Cranmer said something particularly interesting when he talked about how he finally decided to write a book about his experiences in 2014, which, by the way, was a time when he was still living in Brownsville Manor. He said that the publication of the book was fraught with setbacks and difficulties. It was as though some force or entity did not want this book published. I'm absolutely sure that that is the case. You have to understand that just because the demon or a demon was no longer able to haunt the home the way it was still around and still very aware. The evil forces, entities, and beings, including the demonic, are always around us, all of the time, guys. That's how they know when we're at our weakest, and that's when they step in and either take over or offer help that eventually and inevitably leads to possession. Just because you might be someone who's protected from being haunted and or possessed by these things, that doesn't mean they don't come around and know what's happening with you all the time, especially if they have a particular interest in you or your home. This is especially true in cases where a person or a family has been tormented over decades by an entity that powerful. They never truly go away. They're just kind of pushed back into the wings, so to speak. While writing the book, Bob did some research on the area of the home and where it was built, the history of it, and things like that. He said he found some very interesting and disturbing things while doing that research. According to Bob, he discovered some very sinister details about the house itself that shed light for him as to why it was so evil. In his book, he talks about a massacre that occurred in the 1700s. A settler woman and her children were massacred and slaughtered by the natives in the area. The woman was buried with her children right where Brownsville Manor stands, and stand it does, as it's still there today. Bob also claims to have come across information that an immigrant laborer who helped build the house had cursed it because the owner refused to pay him some money he had owed him for his labor and help in the building of the beautiful mansion. Also, inside of the home at some point in the late 19th or early 20th century, a doctor had performed illegal services to scared pregnant women. I can't say the word of what he was doing, but y'all can figure it out yourselves. If we take into account all of the ominous and sinister things we just learned about the property itself, then we can surely understand why a demonic force or presence would feel right at home there, right? Bob Cranmer and his family remain convinced that they were in fact dealing with a demon or demons and not a regular haunting like that of a ghost or something similar. He said, quote, "A ghost, if you believe in them, is generally the soul of a person who passed on in some tragic event or something. A demon is actually the opposite of an angel. The existence of this thing manifested itself in a much different way than a ghost would. A ghost is generally reliving some type of event that took place during a life. Sometimes they can interact with people that are alive. In our case, this was demonic, evil, malicious, malevolent spirit that interacted with us on a regular basis, and it wanted to hurt us. It wanted to drive us out of the house. There was no pretense of it being some kind of lost soul," end quote. Let's break down what Bob said solely based on my professional knowledge and life experience. And if you disagree or have experienced anything different, let us know in the comments below. First of all, while I can understand why most people outside of this community and with very limited knowledge of the paranormal would and could believe that a ghost is the soul of a former human being who died tragically or suddenly, this isn't the case. It's usually not the case at all. This is only true when it comes to what we call residual hauntings. And while those types of hauntings are the most common haunting there is, those types of hauntings are about energy and tragedy for the most part. It isn't actually the spirit of the person who passed and is just the leftover energy from the extremely horrible thing that just happened. Residual hauntings can last for centuries and aren't usually violent. Sometimes they are, but they're not usually. So, while I agree 100% that this was not a residual haunting, I disagree with Bob's reasoning for it. A demon is not the opposite of an angel. Demons are fallen angels. They are angels. As far as him saying, quote, the existence of this thing manifested itself in a much different way than a ghost would, end quote, yes, that's definitely true. And even though it's also true that sometimes ghosts and earthbound spirits get violent and act crazy in our homes and toward us and our families, they're nothing compared to the demonic. They're also, usually, as nothing is 100% true all of the time across the board, it's much easier to get rid of them than demons. Usually someone like me can make or create a light for them to cross over, and even the nastiest seeming ghost, when talked to properly and helped in the right way, when approached without fear but with compassion, will usually move into that light. At the very least, they won't be violent anymore, and most of the time will become more aware of their own situation. Many earthbound spirits don't know they're dead. So if you could just show compassion and imagine the pain, confusion, and agitation that would cause, you can easily sympathize with them instead of fearing them. Or at least, in my opinion, that's what should happen, but I've been seeing and dealing with them my whole life, so I might see things a little bit differently. That's another thing you guys can let me know in the comments, please. Let's go over the last part of what Bob said, and I'm going to quote him again, so just bear with me because it's for good reason and educational purposes as well. So he said lastly, quote, a ghost is generally reliving some type of event that took place during life. Sometimes they can interact with people that are alive. In our case, this was a demonic, evil, malicious, malevolent spirit that interacted with us on a regular basis, and it wanted to hurt us. It wanted to drive us out of the house. There was no pretense of it being some kind of lost soul, end quote. I said it before and I'll say it again. A ghost is not generally reliving some type of event that took place during a place, except for when you're dealing with a residual haunting. Yes, sometimes, most times, a ghost or earthbound spirit can interact violently or pleasantly or any way in between with human beings. That's the whole point of a haunting, but in a residual haunting, as he is describing it here, that's usually not the case, and something is just happening around the people living in the home or who are otherwise around the haunting itself. Try to stay with me. I'm breaking this down as best I can. He is absolutely correct in assuming the demonic force in his home wanted him out and was tormenting him and his family in order to do just that. But at the same time, it more than likely wanted their souls, or at the very least, the soul of that particular little boy. That's why the boy told the priest he absolutely could not come into his room to bless it. Guaranteed that little boy was either threatened or compelled to do that. He more than likely has no memory of it and could have been in the midst of a temporary possession or a jumping, as I like to call it, where the entity or force overtook him and forced him to say those things, physically forced him. This is a case where the demon or demons didn't pretend to be former humans who were lost and looking for friendship or the light. I know of this demon just from research, and thank God not from personally ever having to deal with it. And it definitely did not need the pretense of gaining their trust because it was powerful enough to do all of those things without trying to fool them or lure them in. Also, now that I thought this through, maybe it wasn't interested in their souls or their energy because it didn't try to befriend anyone. The little boy concerns me, and I believe he might be the only one who was at risk for possible possession. After all, and remember, his toys were found in an inaccessible place in the walls. He didn't put them there. Nobody could have put them there because the place was hidden in the walls. No one could get to it, and no one even knew it was there. So again, while I absolutely agree with Bob that this was a demonic haunting, a lot of what he said just sounds uneducated and like he was taking his opinions or things other people who don't know much about it told him and believing it enough to put it in his book without doing any research, or better yet, the proper research. So let's move on. When Bob's book was released, it was incredibly popular and well received. It earned him many different television appearances, and it was widely coming to be known as one of the best records of a demonic haunting, or even of a haunting in general, that we as the public had ever seen before at that time. With all of this success, of course, came just as much skepticism. So much of the skepticism came from the fact that nearly everyone who had lived in the home before Bob and his family moved in, including the descendants of the previous occupants that were deceased, said they never experienced anything even close to a haunting, let alone such a harrowing ordeal as what the Cranmers were saying happened to them. This was strange to me for a few reasons. One of the reasons is the fact that the elderly couple who sold them the house seemed to know more than they were letting on about what was going on in the house. If the history is as tragic and horrific as Bob says it is, then surely the old manor would have been haunted for as long as it stood, right? That just makes sense. It isn't like Bob is claiming he and his family woke something long dormant up when they moved in or something like that. But again, my mind goes back to the son. He seemed to be the main focus of the demonic force in the home. Did Bob's religious views, the fact that he had been saved by his brother who taught him all about the Bible and what Jesus is known to have done for us, have anything to do with it? Could it have been the fact that Bob was a lapsed and somewhat failed preacher? I don't mean to attack him or mean it in any negative way, just that for a while he tried his luck on the pulpit and it didn't work out. According to Bob himself, he just wasn't cut out for professional preaching. There's a specific report from a woman named Karen Dwyer that was circulated, and she had lived in the home for 7 years in the 50s and the 60s. She said, quote, "My mother never said anything about the house being haunted. My grandmother never said anything about the house being haunted. And my grandfather never said anything about the house being haunted. If he wants to go and write it from 1988 and go forward, do it. I don't care. But if you want to lie about other people and things that happened before that, well, no, that's not right," end quote. Karen Dwyer wrote that. Because of this and several other reports of the same kind were surfacing, and people who were associated with and who had lived in the home were coming forward and blatantly, in most cases, calling Bob a liar, many critics went after him, claiming he and his family had fabricated the whole haunting for nothing more than financial gain. They accused him of trying to pass off a complete work of fiction as something true and factual that happened to him and his family for fame and publicity. Bob definitely defended himself, though, and he fired back at his critics and accused all of them of hiding the truth in order to save their own reputations. Remember the time we're dealing with here, and while in 2014 it was much more acceptable to talk about a haunting, it wouldn't have been in the decades before when all of these people were claiming to have lived in or otherwise had access to the house. He mainly accused them, though, of not talking about the haunting and harrowing ordeals that he believed they definitely went through and experienced, because at any time in the past other than the past few years, it was not a good thing when you're trying to sell a house and you tell potential buyers that it's haunted, specifically when it's haunted by a demonic force. I gotta tell you guys, I believe Bob wholeheartedly, but I sit here wondering if maybe the force was awakened by the elderly couple who lived there before he moved in with his family. Maybe they somehow inadvertently or purposefully did something to shake up the long dormant demonic presence, and maybe that's why it came back with such a vengeance towards Bob and his family. Bob talked about all of this, and in part he said, quote, "People are always concerned that they can be held legally liable if they do not reveal to buyers problems of a spiritual nature with the house," which I discovered is not the case in Pennsylvania. Their reactions are obviously intended to cover up the deception used in selling the house both in 1979 and in 1988. The house was not officially sold in 1941 by the original owners, but was purchased via a sheriff's sale. The house sat empty then for an extended period and became known as the haunted house by the local children who ventured into it, end quote. This is actually true. There's another haunted house on Brownsville Road, and Bob talked about being dared to go into it when he was younger by his friends, but that he was too scared. He said that all of the local kids knew about that house and stayed as far away from it as possible. However, he explained that once he bought the Brownsville Manor, one of his friends, a well-respected person who wasn't at all the type to believe in things like ghosts and hauntings, said to him something to the effect of, quote, "So you bought the haunted house, huh?" end quote. And he was no nonsense and serious about it when he asked. Bob was initially taken aback because he had to explain to the man that he hadn't bought the haunted house, but he had bought Brownsville Manor. Bob originally thought that the guy was talking about the other haunted house that was much more well known and that he had feared since childhood. The friend quickly told him he knew which house Bob had bought, and he stood by what he said. They never discussed it again, but as things started to happen in the home, Bob thought back to that conversation many times. It's hard to imagine for some people nowadays that people wouldn't talk about a haunting or admit during a sale that a house or property is haunted, but that's just because the paranormal community is so huge, and something like 73% of Americans say they would knowingly buy a haunted house. Not a good idea, in my opinion, but those are statistically the facts. It's 2024, and just 4 years ago, the percentage of Americans who would knowingly buy a haunted house was only 59%. That's quite a jump. It's popular now, for better and for worse, and like I said, that's why so many people can't completely understand why no one would mention it, and they would just want to quickly get the house off their hands and out of their lives. Bob said the house sat dormant for a long time and that the people who owned, lived in, and then sold the home wouldn't want to admit it now, all this time later, that the place was haunted, because then they could technically be held liable in court for withholding pertinent and possibly dangerous information from the would-be buyers. But that's not true in Pennsylvania. You don't have to let potential buyers know that there's a spiritual issue with the home. I want to talk about the fact that so many of those people said they lived in the house for years and never had any problems. I don't know if that's true or not, but I definitely believe Bob when he talks about what he and his family experienced, and here's one of the reasons why. It's a known fact that Bob had always wanted to live in the Brownsville Manor. He knew from a very young age that he would own that particular house and no other. He talked about being jealous when his brother had gotten the opportunity to visit the house for some reason at some point. He said he felt like his brother was intruding on, quote, his house, end quote. This is actually somewhat concerning for me because in my experience, this means that the demonic force or whatever was haunting that house, and I do believe it was a demonic force or entity, was calling specifically to Bob. I absolutely think there's a connection between his lapse in religion and failure at becoming a pastor and all of the issues he had when he was younger regarding religion. He was originally a complete and total non-believer until his brother started somewhat pushing it onto him and reading the Bible to him. That's when Bob finally had his religious awakening and decided he believed wholeheartedly in this religion. I say it like that because I think it was definitely Catholicism, but I'm not 1,000,000% sure. It could have been Christianity. And before you attack me in the comments, don't bother. I believe what I believe. You will not change my mind. And I believe Christianity and Catholicism are almost two completely different religions. Granted, they hold some similar beliefs. Bob also said he spoke to a woman named Barbara Wagner, and she told him that there had been substantial paranormal activity at the house before Bob and Lisa bought it. Another man in the neighborhood also confirmed this as well. Bob spoke to another elderly witness who told him that she had lived there when she was only a toddler, and she said that she very clearly remembered things being thrown at her head and body that seemingly came from nowhere. There was no one around who could have launched the various items at her, mainly shoes, and they were being thrown by unseen hands. Bob has gone on the record saying he took and passed a lie detector test about the events and incidents he claims have happened in the house that he wrote about in his book. He said he did this to prove himself right and that he wasn't a liar at all and had always told the complete and total truth about the situation. So, for as financially successful as the book was, and remember, he said that something didn't want him to write it in the first place and kept trying to stop him from doing so, his personal life started to decline rapidly around 2015. His son David died and his wife spiraled deeper and deeper into a terrible depression, probably over her son dying. This eventually resulted in the disintegration of the Cranmers' marriage. Bob stayed resolute about what they had experienced though, and he didn't care anymore who thought what. Bob continues to do interviews and talk about what happened to him and his family in that house. That's actually how I came across this story. I saw a short interview with him on YouTube where he was discussing it, like I stated in the very beginning of this video. So, what do you all think really happened to the Cranmers in that house? I already told you my thoughts and opinions and revealed all of my educated guesses, so now it's your turn. Just remember to be kind and respectful to not only myself, but to yourself and to others and everyone involved here in the comments as well. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me, and spread the love by sharing this video. In the description box, you will find a way to get in touch with me and contact me, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. You will find links to all of my books on Amazon, Kindle, paperback, and Audible. I'm in a little bit of a hurry today, so I tried not to speed through this. I hope you guys got all the information. Just check out the description box. New upload schedule only until the week of September 3rd is Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We're still doing Friday Night Live Intuitive Oracle, and there's other live streams that we do, not myself because I don't have the time during the summer, but there are other live streams throughout the week as well. I'm going to keep it short and simple. Donate, PayPal, Cash App, my Amazon wish list gift link, become a member, join my Patreon, whatever y'all want to do. The information is in the description box. Donations are how I get paid, at least for right now. Be kind to each other. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today, you are a badass. You got this, and abundance is your birthright. I believe in you. I got your back. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger, and I'll see you guys next time.